A quick introduction about Mr. Milind Bhandarkar. He is the chief scientist of Pivotal, and he likes the titles like chief scientist, chief architect, etc. And then he was in Greenplum, he was in LinkedIn, etc., doing a lot of good work there. And then, as I mentioned to you, Big Data 100. He's on the board of directors of Big Data 100. I remember my own times when there was called R&D 100 for all the R&D worldwide. I was the chairman, so it's a lot of work. And without much ado, I request him to enlighten us.
Good morning. I'm Milind Bhandarkar. Currently a chief scientist at Pivotal, which was recently spun off from our parent companies, EMC and VMware. So in the early, when the agenda was published earlier, I think my talk was the one just before lunch. And having spoken at many workshops and conferences, I know that that's the worst time for somebody to talk, not to stand between the audience and their lunch, right? Fortunately, Kaz, my ex-colleague and dear friend, is now substituting that slot. So that responsibility is off of me. So what I'm going to be talking today is the title of the talk. I intentionally kept it as vague as I could. Hadoop is, to us, or to me personally, been a foundation for change in this big data or this analytics industry, right? And what I'm going to be talking today is just giving you a brief overview of where Hadoop came from and what is it being used for in various industries, and see what it could be used for and what these new use cases of Hadoop that are coming up, how they are impacting the shape of the platform, okay? As the introduction goes, basically my background is from high-performance computing. Worked on a lot of supercomputers and stuff like that, doing parallel processing on that. But my latest claim to fame is that I was one of the founding members of the Hadoop team at Yahoo. Okay, and since then, I led the Grid Solutions team, the Hadoop Solutions team at Yahoo, helping thousands of engineers and scientists move their applications or implement their applications on top of Hadoop. And after Yahoo, I spent a few months in LinkedIn and then got back into Hadoop evangelism as part of Pivotal. Okay? So while I was preparing for this talk, I came across this quote from Alistair Crowell, who is a regular blogger at O'Reilly Media, talks about big data most of the time. And this quote basically goes like this. The first, when the technology comes in, everybody gets super excited about it. The technology is great, right? After that, because of the hype, I guess, and this quote actually corresponds very nicely with the Gartner's hype curve, right? So first it is great, and then people sort of fall into this trough of disillusionment with the technology, and then the technology gets stable, right? What I have seen over the years, since 2005 to today, almost for 8 years, is that Hadoop has sort of followed the same trajectory, okay? And in order to see where it is going or what it is being used today, I think we need to understand some history about Hadoop, how it came about, and what it was used for, and things like that. Right? Most of you might already know about Hadoop, since there has been so much hype, so much press. But I'll just like to quickly go over the history. Okay? So obviously, everybody knows that Google, when they started building this infrastructure for searching the entire World Wide Web, they basically realized that the traditional technologies that were out in the market, they could not satisfy their needs, right? So they started building what they called as the Google File System, which was a data center scale file system, and a simple processing or simple parallel processing framework on top of it called MapReduce, okay? While they did not actually publish the source code that they had for Google File System and Google MapReduce, they published their descriptions of how they implemented it, what were the features, what were the good parts, what were the bad parts about it, right? And these came in about 2003, 2004, right? And based on that, in the meanwhile, Yahoo was still in the search business at that time. They had not outsourced their search infrastructure to Microsoft, right? And the way Yahoo search got started is that in 2003, Yahoo acquired two companies. One was called Ink2Me, one of the first parallel search engines for the web, right? Founded out of Berkeley back in 96 or something like that. And the second company was called Overture, which was an ad targeting company, right? Search ad display company. So combining these two things, and they formed Yahoo Search. Now, having witnessed how Overture came into Yahoo and having witnessed how their technology platform was implemented, Overture was essentially, 300 to 400 Perl scripts binding major Oracle databases together. And Ink2Me was a clustered computing company that actually was using commodity computers, clusters of commodity computers, and bringing these two together was a major effort, right? So Eric Bolschweiler, who was leading the content, which is sort of the search backend infrastructure at that time for Ink2Me, he realized that we need to follow a completely different approach if we have to scale this Yahoo search infrastructure, okay? So one challenge that he essentially put to us was something that we called as W1W, right? So you're crawling all these web pages on the web, and then you have these what we form page graph, right? One page linking to the other. So this in Yahoo's search's terminology was called web map. Okay. So forming the web map and doing indexing, doing processing, doing PageRank-like computations on that. That was the web map processing that was being done at Yahoo on about 300 to 400 machines clustered. But it used to take almost 6 weeks. Okay? And obviously, new web pages are coming in. They do not appear in your search index, which basically means the user experience is bad for search users. Okay? So the challenge was to build this web map or process this web map in 1 week. And while simultaneously the index was increasing from 10 billion pages to now I think the Google search index is something like 2 trillion pages. Okay? So Dreadnought was the infrastructure that earlier Yahoo Search had built for, actually Ink2Me had built for web map. What we started building was a framework called Juggernaut. This was back in summer of 2005. So what we did is essentially followed the blueprints of the Google file system and Google MapReduce papers. By the way, the Dreadnought framework had very similar abstractions as the Google, the missing component in that framework was this distributed file system. Okay? So we started building Juggernaut file system and Juggernaut MapReduce framework, and we approached University of Wisconsin for their scheduling software called Condor. We worked on it for about 6 months, I would say, and we actually had a working prototype. We had almost 100 machines running this Juggernaut MapReduce and having this Juggernaut file system. But then simultaneously, a lot of things happened. Okay? A person by the name of Doug Cutting, he was contracting with Overture, building the open source search engine called Lucene while on their payroll, right? And Nudge was essentially the content system for that open source search engine called Lucene, right? So he also came across the same papers at around the same time, and he basically thought that, well, the Google file system and Google MapReduce seems to be the right approach for even for Lucene, even if Lucene was not supposed to be sort of a World Wide Web-wide search engine, even for enterprise searches, it is still a good idea. And so he started implementing the Google file system-like file system called Nudge file system, or NDFS, Nudge Distributed File System, and the Nudge MapReduce programming framework. The team at Yahoo, which was building Juggernaut, where I was part of that, we came across that, and we decided to just abandon all our efforts that we had done for 6 months in favor of Hadoop, right? And the reason was essentially that we would have community involvement, and then infrastructure itself was not a moneymaker for Yahoo. Yahoo was essentially making money off of serving ads, okay? And therefore, do we really need this huge team in order to build this proprietary infrastructure? That was really the thinking behind adopting open source in this case. So after working on this Hadoop, this newfangled Hadoop platform for about 6 months, I would say, from around November 2005 to April 2006, at the time we adopted Hadoop, it was being used at only one organization. This is the Internet Archive. okay? And they had about 20 machines, and 20 machines was sort of the upper limit on scalability of Hadoop at the time we adopted it. After 6 months, after having spent too much time, or not too much time, but a lot of time on scaling it, on stabilizing it, and making it performant, at the end of April 2006, we borrowed some machines from earlier Yahoo search groups. These were end-of-life machines, literally. And we formed a 600 machine cluster on which we deployed Hadoop. And I think one of the decisions that this team made at Yahoo at that time, which is that this software is going to run, our Hadoop platform is going to run as a service to rest of Yahoo. Rather than everybody acquiring their own clusters and deploying this software on it, we will own and operate these clusters running this software, right? And users, that is other parts of Yahoo, the engineers and scientists working in analytics, working in search engines, they will essentially just request an account on this cluster, and we will give it to them, and they will port their applications on top of it. That was, I think, one of the best decisions, because the lessons that we learned from building and operating that clusters were actually invaluable in building this software, in putting features in this software, okay? So some of the lessons that we learned in operating Kryptonite as a cluster was that we need to be multi-tenant from the ground up. Right? We cannot assume that this cluster or this system, this platform is dedicated for one person, one team, one group, right? It is going to be a shared platform, and therefore it needs to have all the resource isolation, resource management, all those kinds of features like file system quotas, all those sorts of features, they need to be there from the beginning. Okay? Obviously that did not happen that way, but eventually we sort of prioritized those features and we got them done. Right? The second thing is that rather than going for a bare metal performance, which is going to give us 10%, 20%, 30% performance benefits, we chose to develop this software for agility, right? So rather than going for bare metal performance, the rapidness or agility with which we could deploy applications, which we could code applications on top of this platform, that took the precedence, okay? The third thing was that we will provision instances, carve out this cluster for various users and various groups, rather than having them procure this hardware themselves. Because what used to happen is that some bright engineer, some bright scientist within Yahoo would get an idea about, if I combine this data with that data, I should be able to get much better click-through rates or whatever, right? Then he would make a proposal to his manager or the director or someone like that. And then we would say, okay, now tell us how much hardware is going to be needed. And then he would say, okay, I would need about 20 machines clustered and would be running this software, Linux, this version of Linux, all those things. And then finally for hardware procurement, this request will go to the hardware requisition committee, which was called HRC. And HRC would meet every Friday, early morning, 8 o'clock, and David Filo, who is the co-founder of Yahoo, used to sit on that committee. And I've witnessed people going into that committee sweating, because he would basically say, okay, why this machine? Why not these existing machines? What are those existing machines doing right now? He would actually log into those machines and check the load on that. It says this machine is only utilized 10%. Why do you need extra 10 machines, right? So this would go on forever. And then it would take about 3 months to acquire those machines. By that time, Google would have implemented some other feature that would have, leapfrogged beyond the capabilities of Yahoo search. So rather than procuring new hardware for every project, we would provision these instances for these new projects. That was one of the major decisions that we had taken. Obviously, having given this platform for users to operate on and users to build applications on, people used to basically just say, okay, I'm going to just port my existing applications application as is on this new platform, right? And that would result in some weird behavior, obviously, of the system. The system was not designed for the existing kind of algorithms, right? You have to port them to MapReduce, etc. But what we learned from that is all these weird use cases of this cluster, we took this as a learning experience, right? And then prioritized features based on that in order to make those weird use cases at least feasible on this platform, right? And the one lesson that we learned, which is very dear to my heart, is that when we collaborate with these academicians, the bright young kids, in colleges, they tend to use this system, or they tend to utilize this system for use cases that you haven't even imagined. Okay? So learning from this academic collaboration and having, so what we did was essentially we took the one 500 node cluster that we have, and we basically said to the universities and researchers, saying that you just have to apply for an account and we'll give it to you. Okay? No questions asked, no IP protection, nothing. So just come here and use it. And then we would monitor the things that they were doing for using web interfaces and a bunch of other things, and we would basically actually learn a lot of things from that. Okay? So this slide is taken from almost 2010. If I were to put it, keep adding logos for 2012, 2013, they won't fit on this slide. So as you can see, the usage of Hadoop really exploded from 2009 to 2010. Okay? This is a more recent slide that you can see that the whole big data landscape and the platforms that they use, the technologies that they use, most of them are open source. Actually, almost all of them are open source. But then people basically carved out their little niche on top of this platform to be a BI on top of Hadoop. Even structured databases do connect to Hadoop, and there is a data connector. So exchange of data happens between structured databases and this Hadoop system. So now the big data landscape, again, this is 2012. The number of announcements that have come since this was published basically again makes this slide probably will not fit, all these logos will not fit in this slide, right? And obviously the Hadoop vendor ecosystem has also grown. And this is a visualization of the relationship between these vendors produced by our friends at Datamere. And you can see hundreds of vendors and hundreds of partnerships being formed in there. This itself is a big data problem, and Mark knows about this. He recently sent me a spreadsheet that went on and on about who is partnering with who else, right? Okay. All right. So before Hadoop, or before this big so-called big data platform, a cheap platform, what used to happen is this. There are several pieces of this data lying around in various silos in various organizations, right? And then data warehousing came along. So in order to get to this data warehouse, all these data sources needed to be integrated, passed through an expensive or a costly ETL process. Some of the data items or datums that did not have a value attached to them, a clear value attached to them, basically got dropped in this ETL process. And then after this ETL process, the data that resulted was in a very tight structured manner, and that went to the data marts, that went to the enterprise data warehouse. Okay? What happened since Hadoop is basically people started treating Hadoop as a cheap, low-cost unifying storage system. Okay? So rather than taking it through this entire costly ETL system, people basically said, all this data, first I'm going to dump on this Hadoop distributed file system in the Hadoop platform. Okay? And after that, rather than doing an ETL, I will do an ELT. So extract data from various sources in my organization, load it onto Hadoop, then do these transformations, the joining and forming these structured data sets in Hadoop. And then we start hearing about these data lakes, data reservoirs. That's what this means. Data landing zones, data landfill, whatever you want to call it. That's what was Hadoop, right? And then from there, again, the structured data sets were created, and they were loaded to EDWs, and they were loaded to the data marts. So now, rather than replacing EDW, or rather than Hadoop becoming sort of the single source of truth, EDW still remained the single source of truth, but for all the raw data, Hadoop was being used. So now there were two systems, right? Somebody basically says, okay, I have this lot of unstructured data, I will use Hadoop. Now they have a giant elephant to manage, okay, in addition to the other giant elephant that they had in the EDW. What has happened in the last few months, or last almost 1 year now, I should say, is that people started thinking about thinking that, all this data I'm already storing and have it in Hadoop. Why am I making an extra copy in my EDW? Why am I creating all these extra copies in the data marts for my data analysts to explore that, right? So what I see happening now is that all this data comes to Hadoop, right? Gets stored there. After the ELT process, the data, the structured data sets still are kept in the same platform. Rather than taking them to EDW or data marts, they are still being put in the Hadoop platform itself. And what has enabled this is the low latency SQL, the true SQL engines. I mean, here I'm saying just my own company's SQL platform, of course, but we have seen a lot of low latency SQL platforms emerging on top of Hadoop in the past year or so. And that is what essentially now Teradata and these large expensive EDW platforms have started, I believe have started feeling the pressure of what Hadoop can do in replacing their EDW platforms rather than just augmenting, right? And the reason that this has happened is really due to the economics of Hadoop, right? We basically saw back in 2008, storing a single terabyte of data in the data warehouse used to cost something like $60,000, right? $60,000 to $70,000. From that, the EDW prices have also felt the pressure of these cheap economic platforms. Now we are at something like $6,000 to $8,000 per terabyte. But then when you look at, I mean, this is software costs only, right? Even with support, Hadoop is an open source software. Anyone can download it and install it and run it, right? But obviously there are a lot of sharp edges. I mean, Hadoop is like a box of sharp knives right now, okay? So people tend to go, or customers tend to go for support. Even with support, the per terabyte cost for Hadoop is something in the range of 1,000 or even less than 1,000, about $500 per terabyte. Okay, so now you can see that the price pressure on the traditional EDW platforms is really becoming a problem for them. All right, so somebody mentioned the Big Data Top 100. Big Data Top 100 that I'm sort of leading, that effort that I'm leading, is intended for building a single benchmark for evaluating the big data lists, the big data systems, and at the end of the year coming up with a list based on the performance of these big data systems, right? So in order to have that, we needed to search for a typical use case of Hadoop, so that if we could program if you could provide a benchmark that represented this typical use case, then really the Big Data Top 100, the 100 top systems, customers could use that for their typical use cases. Okay, so started searching for what is a typical use case, and I talked to a lot of customers in various retail domains, not only my company's customers, Pivotal or Greenplum's customers, but other companies' customers as well. And what I think is a typical Hadoop use case, a typical big data use case, and you have heard last couple of talks also alluding to this, is this user modeling, and user in this case is in quotes, okay? So user is not a human user for all the domains. It could be different notion of user everywhere. So the idea is to monitor and acquire the activities of these so-called users and model the behavior of those users, right? What the traditional marketing or analytics used to do by market segmentation or customer segmentation, now it's more intended towards customer personalization, providing them personalized experiences rather than just based on a market segment, right? So this is a typical use case that I see. In the retail domain, obviously a user is a customer. The activities can be both online, because most of the retail stores have online presence as well, and offline activities in the brick and mortar store. So, and the goal of this is a personalized product recommendation, like a recommendation engine. If you bought this, then you also might want to buy this, that kind of thing, right? In the IT infrastructure, and this was actually a very, very pleasant use case for me, because I've seen how the IT infrastructure is managed. If it goes to sort of thousands or hundreds of machines, or tens of thousands of machines and software applications running there, you are essentially monitoring, logging the metrics, all these things for those hardware and software components. And now the goal for mining this is to determine the behavior of this hardware and software component almost in real time, so that you could proactively alert on the imminent failure for some of these components, okay? In the healthcare, user is a patient. You have all this data about the users because of EHRs now, and some of the things like 3G Wi-Fi enabled pillboxes that notify this central server whether this patient has taken the pill on time or not. You're collecting all this data, and obviously the goal in this case is, since hospital readmissions are very expensive on the healthcare costs of this country, to prevent hospital readmissions for these users or for these patients, right? In the telecom, there was one case study I think Mayank already cited, which is that the user is obviously a subscriber. You are collecting all this data about the calls made, and this is not only the telecom company. Apparently, the NSA also is doing that, and they are also trying to reduce the customer churn probably. So the goal here is to reduce the customer churn. And obviously, one of the prime use cases that got Hadoop started was this ad-supported web, where the user is actually a website user, and the activities is not only what the user declares themselves to be, but actually how they are behaving on your site. You are collecting all these clicks on this content, all the likes on Facebook, the reposting of certain things on Twitter or search queries, and the goal is to increase engagement so that a user stays on the site a longer time and therefore sees a lot more ads, or basically make them to click on the revenue generated content, right? So these are some of the use cases, and as you can see, these use cases are achieved with a very similar pattern in all these applications that I call as the user modeling pipeline. You are collecting all this data about the users, somehow identifying that across all these data sets, the notion of user identity remains the same. But once you collect all this data, first thing that you have to do is see and observe patterns in this user's behavior. And for that, you have to sessionize all this data. So in a single session, the user went here, and then after that did this, and then after that came back, and then did that. That's sort of the session. Based on these sessions, now you generate the features and targets for those sessions. This is where you actually do a lot of work in cleansing the data, in trying to determine which features are useful for the goal that you have in mind. And obviously not all the features can be considered, because the typical user activity has a really large number of possible activities that people can do on, let's say, a large website. But then you can actually, and a typical user himself or herself actually engages in very few of those activities. So we call that a very sparse feature vector, right? So since this results in a very sparse feature vectors, you do lots of pre-aggregations about these sessions to determine what features are important. And then after that, you train the model about each individual user. So for each individual user, you basically say, based on this historical data, this is the model that I create for this user, and then do offline scoring in order to validate this model and then load it to the server, so that the next time this user visits your site, you know this user is interested in this particular kind of sports, drinks this particular kind of beer, all those kinds of things, right? So this is basically a typical user modeling pipeline, and I see more and more industries, and rather than industries, the leaders in these industries are already doing this, the user modeling pipeline, and now the laggards are basically catching up, and that's why you see all this hype about, or I won't even call it a hype anymore, because people are actually getting 10%, 20%, goal increases, whatever their goal is. All right. So having said that, what do we expect to see next? Okay. Over the last few months, there have been a lot of articles about where Hadoop is going to go, what's the future of Hadoop, what is the future of this whole big data, and obviously everybody refers to the Gartner hype cycle, right? So is Hadoop going to fall in this trough of disillusionment? Because if you see, this is written in a very small font there, but big data seems to be, and this came out earlier this year, I guess, big data is right there near the peak, right? So probably next year, according to if big data and Hadoop follow the Gartner hype cycle, then it's going to go down. Okay, so that's one thought on by these analysts. But then we also see from the same organization, Gartner, by apparently the same analysts, they basically predict that Hadoop will be in all the products everywhere by 2015, right? So what is it, right? If you look at it, you can compare both of those things and say, okay, there is a golden middle that basically say, yes, Hadoop will be there in all the products, but it will be in an embedded form. You won't actually expose Hadoop to the end user, right? And I think that we see a lot of activity happening in that area, right? One thing we have been very clear about as to what is going to happen is obviously there's going to be these storage wars, and they have already started. HDFS, the Hadoop Distributed File System, was proposed as the most optimized store for running MapReduce jobs. Obviously, there were people did not agree, and there were implementations of alternate file system. A company called Cosmix came up with Cosmos FS, which was later adopted by a company called Quantcast, and they came up with the Quantcast FS. The Hadoop community itself built connectors to the local file system so that the NFS mounted file systems, they could be used in the Hadoop ecosystem, and to S3, right? But then back in 2011, a company, a venture funded company called MapR basically came onto the scene and said MapR FS is the best file system that works with Hadoop, very optimized and all those things, right? And now we have seen IBM proposing GPFS. EMC has a product called Isilon, which is a scale out NAS. It's offering a Hadoop compatibility, Atmos object storage, OpenStack Swift object storage. NetApp is coming up with or has declared something called NetApp Open Solution for Hadoop. So all these traditional file system vendors are basically now molding their file system or their storage systems in order to work in a more performant way, a more manageable way with Hadoop, right? And we have seen a bunch of other new file systems, parallel file system, distributed file system come into this space as well. Okay? So storage wars are going to continue for at least in the next few years. And I don't think there will be a single winner. There will be multiple winners, but they all will basically say, survive by saying that we are compatible with Hadoop and we work the best with Hadoop. All right. The second thing that has happened over the last year is this notion that, we are not SQL. I mean, if I have organized and attended the Hadoop Summit since 2008. This is the 6th Hadoop Summit. In the first 4 or 5 Hadoop Summits, Hadoop community actually took pride in saying that, oh, no, we are not SQL. SQL is for dummies, right? We are basically the upper edge of that SQL community. And now, in the last year or so, what we have seen is that they realize that they are losing out on a lot of end users, lot of customers, because they do not have this full SQL support, right? And over the last year, we have seen from my company, we released the Greenplum database to run directly on top of HDFS, and that product we call as Pivotal Hawk. Cloudera came up with a built from scratch SQL engine that they took Hive and removed the MapReduce part from it and run directly inside their execution engine. That's called Impala. There is a project going on. Primary sponsor there is MapR, and this is called Apache Drill, and a bunch of others. And I'm pretty sure there will be more and more of those to come. Microsoft recently announced a project called Polybase. The main difference between these two kinds of approaches is that you take your existing database's execution engine and you fetch data via external connectors via Hadoop, versus the SQL on Hadoop are basically the native SQL execution engine storing their data in the native formats in Hadoop. Right? So that's sort of where things are going, and you will see a lot of articles, a lot of performance comparisons among all these offerings. What has happened with this though is now earlier Hadoop used to be only used for batch-oriented processing. With these low latency SQL engines, we have seen now batch and interactive, both of them coming together in a single platform. And that actually will, in my prediction, it will actually enable replacing your EDW with Hadoop rather than just augmenting it, okay? All right, so in future, I would say you have to prepare for convergence. We have seen 3 different communities going in parallel for quite a while now, right? The high-performance computing community essentially came up with really fast bare metal performance, okay? The big data community is basically focusing on these NoSQL, you are dealing with these large amounts of data, so it cannot be contained in one disk, so it needs to be sharded, all those things, right? And the database community has been sort of going from the other side of things, which is let's make a performant, consistent SQL engine, declarative language engine on top of the small amount of data, and now let's scale it, right? So the databases and the big data communities are essentially, I think, converging, and they will converge this pretty soon, I would say. Okay? And where is this convergence going to be coming from? If you look at the architecture of all these systems, right, there are components in there that everybody in each of these communities tries to build from scratch. Okay? The way we are going to make this convergence happen sooner is to identify all these components and basically host them as separate services. Right? So the building blocks of this converged architecture are going to be services that are common to all of these systems, and then these systems will basically be the best of breed systems that use these building blocks and implement on top of them. Okay? What we have seen emerge in the last few years again is a notion of Hadoop as a service. Right? Amazon's EC2 implemented this layer on top of EC2 called Elastic MapReduce, where you just submit a MapReduce job, the rest of the things are taken care of by Amazon, okay? By the EC2 infrastructure. We have seen that a similar movement has emerged across a multiple cloud provider, Google Compute Engine, OpenStack, CloudStack, Giant, all of these guys who are offering cloud services are basically making Hadoop available as a service. We have also seen a few pioneers promoting application as a service. Right? This is not the standard notion of software as a service, but really making targeted applications, because software as a service that you see in Salesforce has become more of a platform oriented rather than specific applications. That's what we are basically seeing is happening in this area as well. Right? And obviously we think that this is the future, and therefore we have invested significant resources at Pivotal to make this happen. Okay? I'll skip a few things and give some few slides and give some time for questions. But this is what we think. Obviously, we have been thinking as Pivotal, we have been thinking about what is this big data platform of future going to look like. Okay? And because of this convergence and the Hadoop economics, I think Hadoop will sit at the core of the next generation big data platform. Obviously, it's not the last 5 or 6 years of Hadoop. It will be something like a Hadoop plus platform, because we have already started seeing that it's not only MapReduce, right? Even in the Apache open source Hadoop community, there is a new project coming up, probably already stable. Actually, it is already stable, called Yarn, which allows you to deploy multiple applications using the same single resource manager, and that do not need to depend on the MapReduce programming framework, right? So MapReduce SQL will see in-memory services, in-memory objects for serving. All of these will essentially take care or take advantage of these building blocks that exist within the Hadoop ecosystem. And this platform is going to be deployed both on the public clouds like Amazon EC2, OpenStack, and all these things, on premise, on physical hardware, or on premise private cloud, all of that. Right? So this is what I think is the big data platform of the future going to look like. How much time does it take? Well, only the time will take. Only the time will tell, right? But I think this is where this entire big data platform community is leading to. All right, just in time for questions.
So I had a question for a long time. When we talk to the customers, there is a myth or whatever you call it. Today, Hadoop is mainly for the large data, but there are millions of customers. They don't have that kind of a data.
Right.
So what's your response to them? I mean, I have my own story, but I just wanted to hear from you.
Sure. Obviously, the origins of Hadoop have something to do with that, right? You basically say petabytes of data, tens of petabytes of data you can process in a single job. I haven't seen actually a single job at Yahoo or even Google processing more than 10 petabytes or 10 petabytes of data in a single job. Okay? If you look at the data statistics or the metrics that came out of Microsoft and Facebook papers, they basically say that an average data analytics job is something around 2 to 3 gigabytes there, and that's almost 90% of the jobs. Right? So really, it's a myth that Hadoop and these other big data platforms are always crunching, tens of petabytes or tens of terabytes of data. In fact, if you code your application right in the MapReduce programming framework, as long as you can avoid the overheads of task launching and all these things, you can actually make it work very nicely, very optimized manner on gigs of data or even a gig of data. Now that said, I can tell you a funny story. When I was doing the Hadoop, I was sort of the front-facing person within Yahoo for managing all the Hadoop users or consulting with them. There was an email on our mailing list basically said that, Hadoop sucks. I've been trying to process this huge CSV file and it doesn't scale up. And basically, so I said, how much data do you have? What are you trying to do with that? And it basically says it's a 3 megabyte data file. I'm saying, okay, 3 megabyte, you can probably process it on your iPhone now, right? Don't come to the Hadoop cluster. So you can actually see that the new kinds of hardware that is being put and the kind of optimizations that the Hadoop community is doing for this is going to reduce the amount of time that it takes to launch the job, right? So the launching overhead is the biggest killer for processing large data sets or processing small data sets, I would say. If you are processing a large data set, you take a few tens of seconds to launch the job, that does not matter because your job is going to run for 1 hour. But if you are processing only maybe a 2 to 3 gigabytes of data, then you need your job to start really fast. And it's not a problem with Hadoop as such, or the scheduling framework or the resource management framework. Is the problem with the MapReduce programming paradigm. The kind of isolation that it gives you and the kind of freedom that it gives you in order to operate this data, basically it's going to cost something, right? And that's basically what is happening. So if you look at Cloudera's Impala or Pivotal's Hawk or all these new SQL systems that essentially bypass MapReduce and implement on top of, you get answers in seconds, right? So it's not a fundamental flaw with Hadoop, but rather with the MapReduce programming framework.
Thank you, Mr. Bhandarkar. It's a fantastic talk and so much of information. You speak fast as well, right? That adds to the whole thing. We appreciate your time and so on.